Five, four, three, two, one. Podcast and video Thunderbirds are go. Hi, Cece.
Hi, Jim. Exciting new format today.
Yeah, so I'm here with my co-partner and co-pilot in crime here, Cece Zhang. This is our first podcast episode where we're doing the video as well. So we're going to post this the video of this on a YouTube channel or probably on our website because there's some slides, believe it or not. We got fancy.
Some very last minute slides.
I don't know. They were done a day before. Devin and I sometimes our written materials, man, we're blowing dry right before the thing starts. I will also apologize in advance. I have a corgi, and it is windy today, so he's decided that barking at the wind is something that's useful to do. And if you have a corgi, you will understand what I mean. He's also very cute. So this is an episode suggested by Cece, because she's been getting a lot of questions from other folks about the role of an operating partner at a private equity firm. I don't get those questions because as the lightning rod for hate, people know better than to just reach out to me. But Cece is very helpful to the world. She's actually a much nicer person. So she does get a lot of these calls. So today we're going to talk about that. And I'm going to be the interviewer, throwing in a few nuggets of semi-wisdom as we go along. But for the most part, I'm going to turn this over to Cece to let her kick things off for us.
Sounds great, Jim. And as you mentioned, I think it's been really interesting seeing how our operating team has evolved over the past 5+ years at Parker Gale. And I've personally noticed, and I think I've talked to some of my peers in the past maybe 6 to 12 months or more, there seems to be an increasing interest in just learning more about the different operating partner models, operating teams, career paths, and things like that. So my hope is that some of these things, I've had general one-on-one discussions with people over time, but hopefully this is a helpful overview of some of the observations we've seen within the industry. Obviously, we have our own perspectives at Parker Gale, but hoping that this is a general discussion that might be helpful to people interested in operating partner roles, operating partner structures, and things like that. So what we'll cover in today's episodes will be one, why have an operating team in the first place? What's the history and evolution of operating partners at private equity firms, which, Jim, I know you've had a lot of history over the past years. What are the different types of operating partner models, which the preview is that they are very different depending on the fund. So there's definitely not a one size fits all. What is the relationship between operating partners and deal teams? How are different operating teams structured within a PE firm? And what are some common paths to becoming an operating partner? So hopefully it'll be a helpful overview, and this may end up being a multi-part series, but excited to have that discussion today.
Very good. And for those of you who are old enough like me, I've tried to teach Cece the old film strip projector from elementary school. They would go beep, and then you would turn the slide ahead, because she's actually controlling. This should be no surprise to you who've worked with Cece before. She's certainly not going to let me have the clicker on this situation. So first up, why have an operating team in the first place?
Well, I would turn that question back on you, Jim. I mean, when we were building out the operating team at Parker Gale, I think we had a different perspective of it. And I think it'd be actually interesting to hear your thoughts on it, and I can add what I've seen over the years. But
sure. Well, let's start with the fund perspective, and maybe the fund, from the LP, your limited partner, your investor's perspective / GP or general partner perspective. At the highest level, let me say this. From an investor standpoint, if you as a GP are just paying yourself way too much money and paying yourself ridiculous salaries and not pouring some of those dollars back into working with portfolio companies, that's just not great optics. I mean, your investors would like to see that you are, your goal is to make money on the carry, make money on the investments, not just make money by paying yourself a giant salary. So the first part about this is, historically, if you've got a giant fund with a lot of dollars coming in and you have a very small team, that's one of the biggest optic incentives, is to move away from that. Now, that's the optics. Is it real value for it? If you have a really successful fund, can you get away with it? Sure. There are funds who have very small teams, have done really, really well, and pay themselves a fortune in current comp. From in general, I think the bullet points are as follows. You're trying to get to value creation faster or easier. And I want to step back for a second and say, not because the operating team are geniuses at value creation. Let's use value creation as we paid X dollars for some portfolio company and we want to sell it for X plus something dollars or X times something dollars. And so that's, how do you create value? You create value by, adding EBITDA, adding revenue, adding EBITDA, cutting costs. Sometimes multiples in a market go up, but you can't count on that. So reality is you got to grow the businesses and grow them profitably in order to add value. Second is and typically very early in the investment is risk mitigation. So you want to make sure that you're not losing your money on a deal or losing out on an opportunity. And so, risk mitigation is a critical thing of having operators as part of the team. We're going to hopefully see things in the businesses that we understand that somebody who's new to that industry or new to that business may not actually see. It's also partly to standardize and scale repeatable models. Now, I should point out, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but firms that are investing in single markets or sector focused firms are going to have an easier time standardizing and scaling repeatable models. If you're a firm, and again, this is not endorsing one way or another of how you run your firm, but if you're a large firm with a lot of dollars investing across a lot of different sectors and segments, maybe you're buying CPG, consumer packaged good companies, you're buying manufacturers, you're buying software companies, healthcare firms, retail firms. Well, this ability to standardize and scale can be somewhat difficult because those industries are all different. But to any degree that your firm is focused, best practices for one small software company, for example, are liable to apply to a second software company. Same thing with manufacturing or CPG. So, if you're a sector focused fund, then it helps you get to scale. And then it allows you, I think, and this is actually very underrated. Cece's done a very good job of this, singing her praises a little bit here, which I won't do very often because I'm just not a kind person. So we're to bring scale to the companies and bring more outside resources, it's better to have an operator that can coordinate those resources. So deal team people know a lot about deals. They typically know bankers, accountants, lawyers, all the things that are necessary to structure a deal, make it, tax efficient, get lenders involved if they need debt on the deal. What they don't know is the ins and outs of some of the companies that they bought from an operating perspective. And oftentimes you're going to need a mix of help in your businesses, and some that you only need on occasional basis. So for example, and Cece's done a great job of this, market diligence when we're looking at a deal, and we're going to talk about stages where the operating team gets involved. And we do that in almost every deal we do. And those market studies, you can't use the same firm every single time. I mean, you could, you're not going to really get good results because there's a lot of different, firms that will do market surveys for you, and they tend to specialize in certain industries. So you'd really like somebody who specialized in that industry. And it can be a lot of work to coordinate a lot of those outside resources and keep a good bench of them. And that's a good reason from both a GP perspective and your investors to have operating people with a good Rolodex of third parties they can bring in the right situations.
What I would also add to that last point in terms of being able to use third-party consultants and tailoring that to how that fits in with your specific portfolio company. Because, as a former consultant myself, I learned a lot at Bain. I learned how to get up to speed on different industries very quickly. But each private equity fund, I know at Parker Dale, we know what our individual portfolio companies need. So it's not helpful just to have a generic statement of work. And we also want to make sure that any learnings that come from using a third party provider continues to live on within that portfolio company. So I think it helps to keep some continuity and applies it specifically to that portfolio company by having someone that understands both the fund as well as the portfolio companies.
Yeah, and it's also keeping the consultants in line. As we both know, the best consultants never finish but never get fired. Our job is to make these things, very tight from using those resources, especially for us in particular. We're a smaller fund investing in smaller companies. We don't have, necessarily lots of free dollars to spend on consultants, especially pricey consultants from Bain. I won't mention any names, CC, and basically the rest of my entire team.
I would love to work with our former Bain colleagues, but I think at our size fund, that might be a little bit more challenging for our portfolio companies.
Correct. This is where I usually make my Bane from Batman
Oh,
joke, which I
I'm,
will,
I'm,
which I'll skip for the purposes of this video. And then I think you've got the second category here from an investment team member perspective, and
yeah.
I think why don't you tackle this one? Because you've done a good job of talking through this half of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when I end up talking to deal team members, whether it's our own colleagues at Parker Dale or, friends and colleagues at other funds, and we end up having a discussion of why do you why do you have an operating team or why are you looking to build an operating team? I ask them a lot, what's the pain points that you're dealing with? And I think if you think about the background of a deal team member and what they enjoy doing, what they're good at doing, what they really want to spend their time, a lot of them is that part of it is managing the existing portfolio, but a big part of it is also looking for new deals and doing the hunt for the next deal, doing the transaction, doing the due diligence. And that's a big part of it too. It's not 100% portfolio management. And so when they think about adding an operating team or getting more leverage, they might look at their own mix of time and say, what percent of my time am I spending on portfolio management? And is that an opportunity cost at looking for the next good deal? Is that part of my core business or expertise or even where I get energy from of managing the existing portfolio versus looking at new investments? And what are areas that I can gain more insights into my existing investments so that I can make better decisions, so that I can ultimately drive a better return? And so I think when you look at the individual investment team member perspective and they really look at the capabilities that they are really strong at and the areas that they want to spend time in, I often hear from some other deal team members that they feel like they might spend too much time managing some of the nitty gritty details of a portfolio company when they could be out finding the next great investment for their fund.
Just true. Definitely true. So let's talk about the history and the evolution of operating partners, because it's relatively new from, I think, from private equity.
I mean, private equity as an industry is still relatively new.
Still relatively new for sure. Totally agree.
So Jim, you've been an operating partner for 2 decades.
Yes.
Two
literally,
plus decades.
Yes. So literally, spring of 2002 was when I started. So yeah, so 21 years.
21 years. You're old enough to go to the bar.
It's an operating partner. Yes, my career, this stage of my career, and this is essentially my third career, is old enough to drink at this point. Very good. That's a good point. I think I may just leave the podcast then and just go do that.
So tell me about, the history of, over the past that you've seen over the past 2+ decades. I think the concept of operating partners has been around for some time, but it's looked different in the past 2 decades up until now. And maybe share a little bit about what it historically looked like or where the origins of this role look like.
Sure. I mean, I think historically it was, call it, the venture guys call it executive in residence. And it was often a CEO or an executive, could have been a COO, could have been like the number two, at a portfolio company for a private equity firm that did really well. It was a nice exit for them. And they bring them on. It was a way to bring them onto the bench, keep them from taking another job while they hunt for a company for that person to run. Typically in a similar industry, maybe the exact same industry, but certainly related. So, if you're a fund that, bought manufacturing companies and you had a CEO that did an incredibly good job and you had a nice exit on that deal, you may bring that person onto your bench and, have them wait. Now, a really good friend of mine and an ex-CFO of one of our portfolio companies, that's exactly what he ended up doing. He became the CEO of another fund's portfolio company, much larger than us. This is a much prior fund. And, when they exited that deal, he sat on the bench for a year and they found another manufacturer for him to run. So that was a very common model. You got a good executive. You don't want them to go somewhere else or work for another firm. You put them on your, payroll of sorts, even as like a contractor or a consultant, sort of part-time. They do a little bit of advice. They may do a few visits to some of your other portfolio companies, but it's essentially an executive residence where you're kind of waiting for them to do another deal. It could often be just a secondary executive. So it may not be the top dog. It may be the second person that's ready for the top seat as well. But these were typically part-time positions you paid them a little money, on a sort of 1099 basis. Maybe they did some work directly at a portfolio company or two over time, but those were mostly visit, write up a report, for a block of
Or
dollars.
maybe you sit on the board, act as an
Maybe some of the
advisor to the
board, sure.
CEO,
Yep.
but
Uh,
potentially more of a part-time basis, which by the way, both of these models, executive in residence and former CEOs, seasoned operators, they still exist today as well. So,
yeah, and
but I think it was more
that's
common in
second.
the past.
Yeah, and that second, the second block of it, they were often retired CEOs or executives that you weren't going to put in another deal, that may just sit around on your deal meetings just to opine on that market, current state of the market, and those folks would more often than not be the board members. And that model was, the second part of that was much more prevalent, because if you're a retired CEO that wasn't gonna interested in taking another CEO job, sitting on the board, overseeing the CEO of a portfolio company is a little more comfortable for that CEO. They didn't feel like this is somebody who's just ready to take my seat at any point in time. Conversely, if that CEO blew up, you had somebody who was effectively retired but knew the industry that could work as an interim CEO while you found your permanent CEO. So that's sort of how it worked. Very informal. I think most of their activities were looking at deals, doing some occasional work for portfolio companies, and then the ones that were retired often than not sit on the board, right? If you look at today, it's a more formalized, embedded and full-time resource. And we're going to talk about the different models there, but it's less about finding people kind of to run your next deal, or retired gray hairs sitting on the board. It's more about having people that are very focused on operations and specialize in it, that are formal, fully part of the team, have very specific jobs within the private equity firm, and for the most part the portfolio company. And it's every firm. And we'll talk about the I'm using my hand here like the podcast people could see, but the people that are our viewing audience can see it. That model has a lot of variations, which we'll talk about. But in today's world, it's less about the formal program is less about an executive in residence and more about a formal operating team. And often funds will have both. You may have somebody who's been a successful executive for one of your deals. You don't make them part of the operating team, but they may also serve as an executive in residence, sitting right beside the operating team as you wait to put that person into a new gig.
So let's talk about the different types of operating partner models that we see today. And what I would caveat again is there is no one size fits all. We've seen very, very different models across the board today. And so these are just some of the common types of operating models and engagement models that we've typically seen. So in general, at a high level, when you think about the common types of operating models, if a private equity firm has an operating team, they may organize them in three broad categories. You may have an operating team that's composed of generalists, which means that they might cover a variety of functions. These generalists may or may not work with just a specific number of portfolio companies, but these are jack of all trades, call it athletes that just help specific portfolio companies across a variety of subjects, and are there to help portfolio company on whatever most needs help. Another typical model is functional experts, which might engage on functional topics. This is how Parker Gale is set up. We think of ourselves in terms of our practice areas, whether it's talent, sales and marketing, product, finance, engineering, at other funds that might include topics such as procurement or sourcing, more operations, depending on the type of investments. But functional experts are typically helping portfolio company in that particular area across maybe the whole portfolio. And then a third category might be industry experts. So depending, again, to Jim's point earlier, we talked about depends on if the fund invests in multiple categories and different types of industries, or if they're more singularly focused on a specific sector. You might have industry experts that give relevant expertise and that know that industry inside and out. And so whether it's things like healthcare, financial services, technology, manufacturing, et cetera. And so between generalists, functional experts, industry experts, an operating team might have a mix of all of them. They might have a mix of two of them. There's no one set model, but These are typically the types of areas that they might help a portfolio company with. Anything you'd
Yeah.
add there, Jim?
Yeah. I mean, I would say if you're just getting generalists, I would point out that they're probably more project managers than anything else, right? Because if you're a generalist, you're not a specialist in a function like sales or marketing or finance or engineering, and you don't have specific industry expertise. You're probably coming from a consulting background where you've run a lot of projects, and just like you did at your Bain days, you got dropped into somewhere brand new, some new industry, some new challenge. If you got a generalist, they're probably coordinating a lot of third-party resources at the portfolio companies, and that just takes the weight off your deal team. I think what we've seen is much more focus on functional experts and industry experts, right? So, and ideally, you're the more narrow focused, it would be both, right? So, for example, we are focused on founder-owned software companies. That's what we do. So when we talk about somebody who is, understands product management, it would be product management in software businesses, because product management for a manufacturer or a healthcare firm could be quite different. So we really want it as specific as possible. Now, if you are a broad fund that does invest across sectors, that may be too difficult, for you to staff all of those functions. And so you punt back to somebody who really understands overall product management, right? And we'll bring in specific experts for those specific portfolio companies, but they understand what you're supposed to do in product. So I think we see less generalists and more functional and industry experts with some, with some crossover between those two. I would say where you
What
don't. Go ahead.
I was say what I might add for my colleagues who are generalists, who I think if I were listening and I were them, I think they might think of themselves as more than project managers. I think the plus side of the generalist is that you end up knowing whatever companies you're working with really, really well. And because you have purview over all the functions, depending on what you're helping them with. And depending again on the operating team, the size, you may be pulling in relevant functional industry experts to drive some sort of transformation or change. But again, that depends on the level of engagement and things that we'll talk about. But I think you are coordinating, but potentially deeper with a fewer portfolio companies.
Yeah, but that goes back to, I don't mean project management is insulting. I mean it more in the way of you simply can't. It would be incredibly egocentric to think that a generalist would understand the details of sales, marketing, product, finance
Across all portfolio companies,
across all
yes.
portfolio companies, across all industries, right? So what they're really good at is gathering those resources, right? And they're very good at and it's not to undersell that. It's just I think we found we're seeing more functional experts and industry experts. Now let's color it on the other end. I wouldn't get too specific. So for example, if you're a private equity firm buying light industrials or manufacturers, having ERP experience. So all these businesses run their back office systems, manufacturing, finance, everything on an enterprise resource planning system or ERP system. You may want somebody on your team who's very familiar with ERP systems, but not a guru in a specific system unless you're going to force all your portfolio companies onto that platform, right? So if you're buying across different industries, you may have somebody who really understands ERP, maybe knows one system historically pretty well, but ideally maybe has worked with several, because you may end up with Epicor, Infor, Oracle, SAP, Microsoft, NetSuite, you name it within your portfolio. So you don't end up too general probably, and you don't end up too specific. And so that's I guess, is it the Goldilocks? Yeah, I beat you to the Goldilocks. Nicely done. All right. The porridge thing I never got. I wouldn't even bother eating the porridge.
I don't like porridge either.
Yeah, who likes porridge? Charles Dickens characters like porridge. All right, so that's one. So that's one, common types of operating models. So let's talk about, regardless of those models, you highlight the level of engagement.
Sure. So if you think about how involved, let's take a step back and just think about how involved like a private equity fund is, regardless of whether you have an operating team or not. Private equity funds may have different perspectives on how hands-on they are with their portfolio companies or not. So, on one end of the spectrum, you have completely hands-off private equity firms, and this is not a bad thing. They have historically, in the world before there were operating partners, And in still many private equity firms, you don't need an operating team, right? You always need an investment team because those are the ones finding the new deals. But if you find good companies, you back good management teams, you get what you need on execution, you can be very hands off and just trust your management team to run it and hold them accountable at the board meetings for things like that. Hands off private equity firms are probably less likely to have uh, a dedicated operating team or might be doing more of the engagement themselves. In the middle, you have, call it a more collaborative engagement model. I think Parker Gale would like to see ourselves in this. Sometimes I think of ourselves like I'd rather be an invited guest at a portfolio company being pulled in versus pushing my way in. And a lot of times we say, we want to do private equity with you, not to you. We want to work hand in hand with our portfolio companies to come up with an approach together to drive the value that we're trying to create throughout the course of the investment. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have very highly prescriptive, highly involved operating teams for private equity firms. So these might be private equity firms that have a very firm opinion on standard playbooks, being very directive. This is potentially more of a push model. They, especially if you have a similar industry sector, if they already know what the best practices is, they might just dictate a lot more of here's what we expect any of our portfolio companies to do. And again, there's no right or wrong model with it. It just varies whether you're hands-off, collaborative, or highly prescriptive. And that comes back to what's the strategy and approach of the fund.
Yeah, no, what I would say in collaborative and highly prescriptive, certainly more with highly prescriptive. Some of the engagement model, we have to understand that for the most part, your private equity firm doesn't want the operating team involved conceptually, right? Without
private
knowing
anybody,
anybody. The portfolio company, right? Sometimes the private equity firm is one, but we'll talk about that in the last few slides. Yeah, in general, it's sort of like when consultants are hired at a company. There's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt as the folks are coming in, right? So the to your point of being invited in, the collaborative approach, even if you're getting to highly prescriptive, is probably the right way to start with any portfolio company, is get to know them. And we'll talk about opportunities to do that in different engagement sections here. But that's a good thing to do early on, because then you end up finding yourself invited in as opposed to starting with highly prescriptive. Now, there are reasons to go highly prescriptive. Let me give you a case in point. If you're a very large private equity firm doing very large leverage buyouts, let's say you're buying a $2 billion software company or manufacturer, they probably have a fairly standardized playbook for those kinds of industries that involve, cost cutting, organizational plans. They may have some standardized playbooks that are much more highly prescriptive. And in those cases, yeah, that may be the right model given the size buyout you're doing, particularly if you've added a lot of debt on the business, and that's the place where I think a lot of private equity firms get a bad reputation, right? Because everybody thinks of barbarians at the gate. And if you haven't read that, it's about the leverage buyout of Nabisco. There's a really good TV movie with James Garner in it that's pretty funny to watch. And that's the reputation. When people think private equity, they often think of, you buy out companies, you fire all the employees, you cut a bunch of the costs. And that's certainly an oversimplification. And there have been cases where that's been done. That's generally the standard model. But in a highly prescriptive, that's often big companies that you put a lot of debt on the business, and they're very similar to other big companies you bought. You may have some standardized plays. And so you may drift between collaborative and highly prescriptive depending on that.
Yeah, and depending on what problems you're trying to solve, right? There are some areas where even at Parker Gill, I'd say we're highly prescriptive on things that we have strong opinions on and that we've seen work over and over again. And in other cases, it might be tailored specifically to the portfolio company. And we're going to do a separate episode specifically on what it's the day-to-day life of an operating partner and what that looks like to work with the portfolio companies. But I would say one of my biggest learnings since I have been at Parker Gale over the past few years is, when I came in, I was like, oh, we own these companies. We have majority ownerships. This should be, in theory, easier than consulting because we could technically force them to do something because we own the whole business. And I think what I quickly learned was, if you don't have alignment, if you're not collaborating with the portfolio company, if they don't believe in what you're trying to ask them to do, the minute you turn your eyes to another portfolio company, they'll go back doing the same thing. And so having that more collaborative approach and co-owning the goals or the value creation plan or whatever it is together makes it much more powerful than just dictating it if they don't fundamentally believe it.
Well, and that goes back to the investment strategy of the firm too. We are control buyers. So we do have the authority. If you use that card, you usually end up sideways with your management teams, but you can use that card if you need to use that card. There are firms who do more club deals, much more common in venture than it is in private equity. But you may have
investments,
yeah, and in those cases, if you have an operating team and you're essentially a minority investor, your only approach is collaborative, and even then it may be difficult because you're not driving the bus.
So let's talk a little bit about the types of engagement models between operating teams. So I think, we talked a little bit before about generalists, functional experts, industry experts. A question that often comes up is, well, how do you, in a portfolio of X number of portfolio companies, whether it's 10 to 30 to 50, however many, how do you actually allocate the resources within your operating team? So this is assuming you have more than one operating partner. And so how do you decide who works on which one? So one of the typical models might be, and I've typically seen this happen with more generalists, you might have an operating team that each person might have 2 or 3 companies that they are fully dedicated to. So if you have a portfolio of 20 companies, one of the operating team members might have 2 or 3, or maybe only 1 or 2, and you might go very, very deep with this company. This might be more the generalist model. And maybe you'll move on to other companies, but in this case, you're more embedded with the companies inside and out and really understanding all of their different needs. Another model that I've seen, this is more of the Parker Gale model, is our operating team has purview over all of our portfolio companies. And so across, our whole ops team, I always joke I don't have any favorite children in the portfolio. I like all the portfolio companies. I want them to do well. I might not spend time with all of them at any given point in time, but I have a general sense of what's going on across all of them, can connect the dots, and I will go deep with them on a more functional or specific area of need. And depending on point in time, what's needed there. And then depending on the fund, sometimes this is correlated to fund size, sometimes it's not. You might have a mix of generalists that are dedicated to a few portfolio companies that might pull in functional experts that are dedicated to all of them. And, again, there's no one size fits all between the types of portfolio company coverage that there might be.
Yeah, I think you'll see a couple things. You in private equity firms that invest across industries. In those cases, it's not often that you have a partner that's covering multiple sectors. So you might say, look, we invest in retail, healthcare, and manufacturing. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but if you do that, then your operating team might actually have, a specialist dedicated to each of those partners and that partner's deals, because there would be different knowledge bases that you would need. So even though it's an operating team, you might have somebody who's got ERP and manufacturing experience that's dedicated to the partner that's doing the manufacturing deals, retail specialists on the retail side, a healthcare specialist on the healthcare side. That makes sense. I mean, there's no reason to dilute your expertise. A healthcare person working across a retail portfolio company may not be any value. So that's a way it's a hybrid model. I would point out in our model where the operating team has purview over multiple, essentially all the portfolio, we're still coordinating with the deal teams and amongst ourselves so we don't kill the patient. Our operating team covers 4 different areas, pillars, if you will, and we don't do them all at the same time. Typically it's, think of it like surgery. We're not going to fix your hip, do a lung transplant, a heart surgery and brain surgery all at the same time. That simply doesn't make sense. So we are coordinating among the teams. What's the highest priority and where should we dig in first? And that typically in the early stages, we're going to talk about what stages we get involved in these deals. We're typically focusing on risk opportunities first, initially after close. So if we have a single point of failure from a person standpoint, there's one person that knows, all there is to know about this. And, there's no backstop for that person. And, their favorite thing to do is, diving with sharks, jumping from an airplane. Yeah, that may be the very first thing we do is figure out how we get, how we do some knowledge transfer with that person to mitigate that risk. Right. So that's always a discussion with the deal team in terms of how and when we engage.
I think that's a good segue. Um, let's talk a little bit about the
Silly
relationship.
rabbits. Segues are for kids.
Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between, operating partners and deal teams through the
Oh, it's
lens
not good.
of
Oh,
the
it's
life
usually
cycle of
bad.
a portfolio.
Oh, it's terrible. Oh,
Is it
that's not the answer.
terrible?
That's not what you were looking for. Oh, I thought I was responding to the question. How is the relationship between? Oh,
I mean, hopefully, at the end of the day, it is up to an investment team or deal team to decide whether they want to add operating partner resources in the first place,
it's true.
right? As we talked about historically. So, um, whoever decided to build each operating team, and we have the history of why we decided to build the operating team, but Parker Gale has their perspective of what value they were hoping that an ops team would add and the roles that they would play. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of a typical portfolio company. And
Yeah.
so,
So maybe tackle this in two dimensions, right? Let's talk about
yeah,
the life cycle first, and then how both the deal team and then the operating team play along that cycle.
sure. So in terms of a life cycle, before a portfolio company becomes a portfolio company, before they're even born, there's a lot of sourcing that is done at a private equity firm to actually find this next deal. There's a ton of activity. There's business development teams, thesis development, so many things that happen in the early stage of a private equity firm's pipeline to find this next deal. Then there's the pre-close. You've signed a deal under LOI and you're doing the sprint, the due diligence to really understand if this is an investment that you want to do. And hopefully you've checked all the boxes, you're excited about the deal, and the transaction closes. So there's like a closing point. So they're sourcing, pre-close / due diligence, transaction closes. Right after the transaction closes, there's, we'll call it a typical 100-day planning period. Not every private equity firm uses that. We can debate on whether or not it should be 100 days, something else. I know, Jim, you have strong opinions there, but call it the first 3 months of the investment. And then there's the ongoing phase of the investment in private equities, typically 3 to 5 years on average. And then there's the point where a private equity firm will exit that portfolio company. And so if you think about these 5 stages, where the deal team and where the operating team get involved will vary, and their levels of involvement will also vary. And again, this all depends on the firm and the fund. But do you want to talk a little bit about the deal team side within this life cycle, Jim?
Sure. I mean, and some of this is dependent on, the model you've chosen for your operating team, right? If they're just a series of generalists, they may not, they're certainly not involved in sourcing. So there's a lot of activities that go into sourcing. By the way, sourcing is completely made up. As we all know in private equity, all deals are proprietary, CC, just so you know. So just fictionally in a world where you had to source or talk to bankers. So they're talking to bankers. They're developing, ideas of markets they want to target. And, they get likely investments that come in. So most of the time the operating team is involved in sourcing. Now, if you're a sector focused fund and your operating team has deep expertise in those end markets, yeah, you may get them involved in the sourcing side to give you a quick yes or no on a given end market or a given, kind of technology. So, I come from a software
You do that all
background.
the time. Yeah.
Yeah. I come from a software background. I've spent my entire career in software and software development. And so when, we only buy software companies, so most times the deal team will flip it by me to say, hey, is this even particularly in a sector that they, a class of software that they weren't, familiar with or didn't even know existed, they may, flip it by me and say, is this ring any bells, or does this look interesting to you? Or would you just stay away from it? Right. So, but for the most part, you're not really involved in sourcing. Now,
And that's not what you were hired.
not what we were hired to do.
Most likely,
Right.
that's not the skill set
Yep.
typically of what you were hired for.
But I will say this, and again, we're crossing over to what the operating partner does. Well, maybe we'll do that in a minute. Let's just keep talking about the deal team, and then we'll cross over. So, they're primarily involved in sourcing and pre-close due diligence. In a lot of cases, they have 100% of the sourcing through basically close and due diligence, right? Particularly if they're not doing, any market studies technical due diligence, if they're largely just doing finance and accounting, legal work, you may not have operating people involved at all. I mean, the deal people typically do themselves.
And in a world where they don't have an operating team, this is some of the meatiest work that deal team
Yes.
members are doing. This is the bread and butter. Is a lot of it is hunting for and finding and doing that new deals. And I think when I talk to our deal team colleagues, even at Parker, they're like they love the hunt for this deal. They love doing transaction. They love this sprint when they're actually in the heart of the deal. And so sourcing and doing a deal is, a huge chunk of where they spend their time and where they would like to spend their time.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you go to any private equity office and deal teams, the whole thing is you want your little headstone, right? So in
The
most deals,
tombstone.
you get a little, I'm a New Englander. I call it headstone. Tombstone's a pizza or a really good movie about a Western with Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday. It's highly underrated. So in those cases, it's how many tombstones, how many headstones you have on your, on the shelf above your desk, right? So yes, they should be excited about sourcing and finding deals and closing them. Closing is a lot of accountants, a lot of lawyers. It becomes a complicated business. And then, the next phase, which I would say the planning and ongoing investment phase, if you're not talking about operating people, that's typically the deal teams working with a portfolio company. Now this can very much vary, by the way. In our case, where we're buying founder-owned businesses, the founder is exiting as part of the deal process. That's one of our investment criteria is typically, our founders aren't 17-year-olds who started a rock star company in their basement. They're in their 40s when they start the company usually, and they're exiting in their 60s, right? And they're usually stepping aside, they're retiring. Statistically, we have a large number of these founders that buy a boat, by the way, which is great for us because we don't have to buy a boat.
Just go have friends with boats.
Exactly. So in those cases, the CEO will be new. And so there's always a lot of coordination because the CEO is typically new to the business as well. If you're a buyout shop buying from, the firms who buy from us, so we sold a number of our companies from our size firm to a larger private equity firm. There's this sort of 100-day planning and ongoing investment is a little less formal because you've already got a plan. Right. They're already working along to a plan. So it's essentially just a different owner. And there's loads of reasons why we do that. Sometimes it is that we've made as much money as we need to on a deal. And it's gotten to the size it is. It's a good time to exit. Sometimes it's that portfolio company could benefit from doing a lot of add-ons, which would put them over just too much dollars from us. We would have too much money in one portfolio company, and we keep a minority investment and sell it on to the next firm that, can execute better on that strategy. They have more money to put to work in that deal. So this will vary. If you're, as part of doing the acquisition, you're making a fundamental change to the management team, there'll be a lot more work in the 100-day planning and ongoing investment than there will be if you're just transferring it to a new owner, right? Same thing, I guess, the metaphor, if people are HGTV, fans, it's a difference between, buying a house, relatively new house, you buy from the old owners because they wanted a bigger house, so they needed to move, you move in, do anything versus fixer upper. If you got the property brothers involved, it's typically a fixer upper, right? So think about it. Think of it as if you're the property brothers, you're probably doing more work here. And then, the deal teams are typically actively leading the exit, the sale process, which is sometimes you get in, over the transom, which I don't think people even know what a transom is anymore. Do you actually know what a transom is?
No.
Yeah. In like old timey buildings, it was a window above the door that opened in. That was a transom. You could put mail in through it or whatever, but it got to breeze in without getting stuff on your desk. It's like if you watch an old time detective movie, you'll see transom. So the deal comes over the transom or slid into your door. You might get a Godfather off from somebody you weren't expecting, and then it's just a sale. Otherwise, you're typically going through a process, which is putting together a deal book, hiring a banker, well, reverse order, hiring a banker, putting together a deal book, and selling that company. And the deal team will be involved in that process, although the banker is the banker is the front bumper on most of that work, right?
So that's what I would
go ahead.
What I would add is that, again, depends on each private equity firm how involved their deal teams are. But when it comes to portfolio management, when a deal team member does a deal, like that is still their deal. The difference between, I think, operating team and deal teams is deal team members will work on a few of the deals within their overall fund.
Yes.
And again, depending on your fund structure, like, we might work across all of them, but that deal team member that is typically the chairman of the board. If they're leading the deal, they are responsible for the ultimate success of that deal. And so there's no world in which they are not actively managed or involved in some way, because that return on that investment is their responsibility. What varies between funds is how actively they are working with their portfolio companies on a day-to-day basis during the hold period. And that comes back to what we talked about earlier, is like, how much are you just backing the management teams, or how much are you involved in the day-to-day operations with the fund and or with the portfolio company? And that's what varies. But the responsibility of the success, I think, of of each investment, like, they feel that as part of their own track records as well.
Yes, I will say the exception, the one place I would disagree with you is that's certainly true at the top level. The partner who leads the deal. In most cases, private equity firms rotate through associates in a 2 and 3 year plan. So you may end up over the life of an investment, same partner, but you might get a different associate.
Yes.
So as they move to the next level or go off to business school, you get the new associate. Sometimes we even trade associates across deals, so they get experience working with a different partner. So the senior person, the deal team member, the partner that closed that deal, they'll be with it for the life of the deal. The associates may trade out a little bit, and that's something you need to be aware of, because you may, you close a deal, and that associate may be on the deal for the first couple of years. You as the operating person may not get involved until the end of it, and then you may be on it for 2 or 3 years, and you'll have a different associate that you're actually the original associate's bringing you up to speed, and then you're bringing the new associate up to speed. So there's a little bit of that disfluency at the associate level.
Yes, that's a good distinction between, deal partner versus a deal associate, for example. So let's talk really quickly about the role of the operating partner. We touched upon this a little bit throughout this life cycle. So as we mentioned, on the sourcing side, potentially lighter touch on sourcing at most funds. Again, that's not what you were hired for. I know I wasn't hired at Parker Gale because of, business development skills, which our colleague Matt has and is great at. On the pre-close due diligence side, this is an area where I think we've seen operating partners increasingly involved in due diligence pre-close. It's one of the things I really appreciate at Parker Gale, because getting to see what's happening at the deal, having an insight into the market, into the company itself, so that we can start to form the value creation plan, gives us a really good sense of what we have to do with the deal after the deal closes, and helps us be faster in hitting the ground running. At other private equity firms, sometimes this can vary. I've heard of the case where, the investment team does a transaction and then throws it over the fence of telling the operating team, here's what we bought, please help us fix it. But I have heard increasingly that operating partners are getting more involved in due diligence pre-close. The meat of where I think we spend most of our time is obviously during the course of the investment, 100-day planning, ongoing investment. This is what you're hired to do. This is where you're spending most of your time, typically the heaviest level of engagement. We didn't touch upon this yet, but it depends on the fund. It really varies whether an operating partner might actually take a seat on the board at a portfolio company. The deal partner almost always has the board seat, and maybe multiple people at the fund. Whether an operating partner takes board seats, that varies based on the fund, based on their model. But no matter what, the responsibility is to help with the ongoing investment. And when it comes to the exit or sale process or the preparation for that can vary. There might be some work leading up to the sale process that operating partners are involved in, but when it comes to the actual day-to-day selling, it depends on the fund. The operating partner might know the deal really well, and so when there's questions coming in from buyers or with the management teams, there might be some partnership. But again, I think that varies.
Yeah, and I would say in general, I'm allied against operating partners taking board seats for a couple of reasons, right? One is just the nature of private equity firms. The deal partner has to be on the board. Typically, the CEO has to be on the board as well. If you're buying from a founder, that founder is typically taking a board seat. And then the junior principal at the private equity firm, somebody who's a deal partner in training, if you will, rarely an associate, but certainly a principal or sometimes a VP, they take a board seat because if they're going to be a deal partner eventually, they need to get experience in sitting in board meetings in a meaningful way, other than just being an observer. putting yet another person from the private equity firm on the board, starts to get too insular. It's, a bunch of people that have a tendency to agree with each other. You typically want to start to get to some outside board members that add a little more value. So that's the reason not to waste an operating person in a board seat. It's also, it's a lot of work, right? From the board perspective, when you're not really, you don't have much impact at the board level. You've got at least 4 board meetings a year. You've got the travel around it, plus the board prep. You're burning some days that could be better spent. And then you also end up, as a board member, it becomes very difficult with the portfolio companies that you're not meeting with somebody who's working from the private equity firm hand in glove with you. You're actually meeting with a board member, and that creates some conflicts as well in some of the operational stuff. So we don't do it. It's nothing wrong with it, but we just, for those reasons, don't think it's a key thing for us to do. And I would make the argument that depending on what you're hiring, I hear a fair bit of, hey, the easiest way to start with an operating team is to hire an internal headhunter, a recruiter, right? But we hear that a lot. I'm not going to say that's good or bad, but if the case is that's what your operating team is a recruiter or two, you probably don't need them involved in sourcing or pre-close diligence at all. They may hit the ground running in the 100-day plan of, hey, these are the openings we have, or the people we need to replace, start filling them, right? The more sector focused you are and the more industry specific or functional specific your operating people are, they'll get involved earlier in the process because it makes sense. You're adding value at that point.
Right. So let's breeze through the last.
I should point out one more thing here. There's the get involved early has some values. Getting involved too early has no value. You're going to waste the time of the operating team. So lots of stuff, if we see 100 deals, we'll still do one. If we see 1,000 deals, we'll still do one, on an annual basis, 1 or 2, right? So if you're heavily involved in the early screening phases, you can burn a lot of hours on that function.
At the opportunity cost of spending time with your existing investments.
Exactly.
But it's a Goldilocks. It's a mix of making sure how do you bring in the operating team early enough to get up to speed, so that they're not playing catch up, but not so early that you're wasting a lot of cycles on deals that are likely not even close to getting done.
I mean, where were her parents? The kid's just wandering around the woods on her own and ends up in a bear's house. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's permissive parenting.
Well, let's jump into our last 2 topics, and we will breeze through this both, I think, for interest of time to make sure this isn't a super long podcast, but also I think there's a lot of complexity here that we'll just touch upon the overall structure, and then our last topic could be an episode on its own, so we can just touch upon it quickly. But let's talk a little bit about the structures of operating team. This is a question that I often get asked. And I think also varies is what does that look like to have an ops team within the fund? And I think what we've seen is there's, again, 2 ends of the spectrum. You can have operating partner members who are a full-time employee of the fund, all the way to what we said in the beginning. You might have more bench players, advisors, board members, things like that might be part of your operating team. And then in the middle, which again can often still feel like full-time members, employees of the fund, you might have internal consulting groups that bill back their time or expenses in some way back to the portfolio companies. You can have captive consulting groups, and then you can also have 1099 contractors that still end up feeling like full-time employees, depending on their model. But you want to add a little bit more to this, Jim, because I think we've seen a lot of different models of this.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I'm not going to say whether one model is good or bad, and sometimes firms have hybrids. We think there's value in having critical members of the operating team as full-time employees of the fund with comp and carry. That doesn't mean we don't have a fairly good network of consultants and contractors available. We do, because we have task-specific things that we need to do that we don't. For example, we have a team that does really good sales training, and that's not a function that we could keep full-time on our portfolio in our team, because we only need to do that once for each portfolio company. And typically it's a couple month-long engagement. So having that as an internal resource, they'd be twiddling their thumbs, right? So I think it will depend much more on whether you're a sector-focused fund or not, how many of those third-party relationships you'll have. When it comes to the sort of in between models, right? And then let's talk about an internal consulting group that's billed back to portfolio companies that is a full-time employee of the firm, right? So you could be a full-time employee. CC and I could be, we are full-time employees at Parker Gale. We are not billed back to our portfolio companies. And our agreements, our LP agreements specifically state that. There's lots of reasons why billing back, can be a challenge. I would tell you at the highest level, typically you'll hear the phrase 2 and 20. That's a 2% management fee on an annual basis on the size of your fund. It's more complicated than that, how many dollars you have outstanding, whatever, but let's just keep it simple for now. And then 20% is your carry after you've returned all your money and your guaranteed return. Any other dollars theoretically should go back pro rata to your investors. So there is some complication when you're billing for your portfolio, you're billing for your operating team. Theoretically, those dollars should go back to your investors. So it has to be carved out in the agreements that it doesn't. Otherwise you're paying an employee, I'd be paying UCC as part of my operating team. And then anything I build from you would go back to my investors. Now it knocks down the amount we owe them back, but I run a budget deficit that I've got you on my payroll, but I don't get your revenue, right? That could be one of the challenges. That can be handled in your agreements. The other way to do it is an external but captive consulting group of operating partners. There's a reason to do it this way. Just forget financial oversight, some rulings around the SEC, but in cases where you have a relatively large operating team and you have two things that you may need to do. If you invest across sectors, you may need to add and remove people on occasion, right? So let's say you're investing in manufacturing, healthcare, financial services, consumer packaged goods. Well, you may need a relatively large team. And as you have a series of investments, you may not have need for all the manufacturing people. So you may need to lay them off. Really hard to do as they're part of a fund, as a captive group, much easier to do. The second reason is that things are typically within a private equity firm managed around the funds themselves. Fund 1, Fund 2, Fund 3, they have a certain amount of dollars. They have a certain set of agreements. The companies are different between the two. You rarely invest across funds. So things can be very tightly controlled. If you've got long range projects that you're working on and you sell a portfolio company, operating team is done, right? So the second we sell a portfolio company, we're in the middle of a project. We no longer own that company. And having one of our operating team members working for that company or working on projects with that company is very difficult, right? Because it's no longer our asset. We're actually doing work for somebody else. So in those cases where you may need to potentially finish projects, across your investment horizon and still get paid for it, having an external group is an easier way to do that. We don't do that model, but all of those models, there's no pluses or minuses. There's structural reasons why you do it one way or the other.
No. And again, it depends on the strategy of the private equity fund and where they're hoping to their own agreements, where they're hoping to add value, how big of an operating team they're thinking of building, etc. So let's touch really quickly upon the reporting structure and then briefly on compensation. So at a high level, in terms of where an operating team might report into, you may have a head of the operating group, like our fearless leader here. And
I'm not the head of the operating group.
and then you might have more hierarchical where you hire more junior resources or whatever the case may be underneath the head of the operating group. In other cases we've seen where it's typically like a really flat structure, and you might have multiple operating people reporting into multiple deal partners. That can be messy at times, but hopefully you get some kind of alignment on where time is being spent, what the goals are of that group. But it really varies in terms of where they sit within a fund.
Yeah, I would say that's true. I would say unless you're building out a really big operating team with multiple levels of skill sets, like a large consulting organization, you're hiring relatively senior people and they're largely self-managed, right? So there's, typically we see more of a flat structure in where you have when you have a relatively small number of operating partners and they're coordinated well with the deal partners and amongst themselves. They're self-managed. They know their job. They know what to do. We're coordinated with the deal partners to make sure that we're, one, not interfering with other stuff that's going on with that particular deal, or two, we know, hey, we've decided we're going to take this thing to market in the next 6 months. That may determine we may not start some projects we were thinking about starting if we're going to be exiting them, in a horizon that's shorter than the length of that project, and just to make sure amongst the operating partners that the two of us aren't scheduled to be on site at the same time and don't even know it. Those kind of things. But those are flat structure is more common, I would say, than a hierarchical structure on operations.
So touching upon compensation really quick, there's different components, again, depending on the private equity fund, but typically everyone has hopefully a base salary. Um, Many private equity firms also pay a bonus. Carried interest is a typical component, especially on the deal team side and depending on the seniority level. Um, it can vary within operating partners. I think that comes back to how you're structured, how that looks like. Um, at Parker Gale, really, I think one of the things that drew me to Parker Gale was the alignment between the deal team and the ops team, and getting that carried interest as to make sure all of the incentives are aligned with the deal team and the portfolio companies. But carried interest is not necessarily um, paid to all operating teams, depending on the structure. And then a component that is mostly applies to founding and managing partners at private equity firms, although has some implications depending on how you structure your private equity fund, is this net fee income. So, Jim, do you want to touch briefly upon that last piece?
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about carried interest for just a second, just so people understand, the concept, right? Let's say we had $100 million fund, and I'm making all these numbers round because my low end math skills are terrible. Despite the fact I'm a software developer by background. So let's say you had $100 million fund, and 100 million was everything. It's it's everything you invest in your companies. It's your 2% management fee. Now you probably have a guaranteed return of like 8%. So let's say that with all the math, whatever, you ended up owing $100 million. That's what you took in, plus $50 million for your guaranteed return. Your 20% comes north of that. So after you paid everything back in the guaranteed return, let's say that every deal in that fund sold and the total dollars was $250 million. Well, then you're getting 20% essentially of $100 million. There's some variations of this, right? So your 250 minus your 150, your guaranteed return, you're getting 20% of those profits after the guaranteed return. And that 20 million bucks goes across all the, everybody who's got carried interest, and you'll have a different percent of carried interest, right? So you've got so many points out of 100 that correspond to 20% of those guaranteed returns. In most cases, newer funds are going to be what's called European waterfall, which means you have to have returned everything, every dollar you took, every guaranteed return before any carry comes out. American waterfall, they start paying it earlier, but you have the possibility of what's called clawback. If your final deals don't return what they need to do, you could be writing money back to the fund. So most folks, conservative folks, are going to want to be on European waterfall. So once they get a carry check, it never has to go back. Having said that, that often means that you're a long way from the carry when you raise a fund. So if you assume you raised a fund today in 2023 of 300 million bucks, don't expect to see any money until you're north of like 2030, 2033, something like that. It could take 8 to 10 years, certainly north of 6 to start seeing it. So I say that because as people think about, well, I'm going to get carry so I can take way less salary, understand that you're going to be a number of years from the carry. It takes a long time, right? And the rules around carry may change from how it's treated from a tax standpoint. So it's a good thing to know you have, but you're not necessarily going to get at it very quickly. And if a fund has already been raised and you come into that fund as an operating partner, there's not going to be a lot of carry left. Typically, you're reserving a few points, but you're not keeping a ton. So if a firm has just raised a fund and you just started at that firm, they may have allocated their carry at that point. They may have reserved some. Hopefully they have for new employees, but if they haven't, they can't take away carry from somebody else to give you carry. So you may get a relatively low amount of carry, and that fund may be invested over 3 or 4 years, maybe a long time before that thing's even starting to mature. Same thing if you come in at the end of the fund. In some ways, that's better. If you come at the end of a fund, they may have no points of carry available for you, but you're there before they raise the next fund. And so they'll carve out points for you. So where they are in their life cycle between funds is pretty important in terms of how much carry they have available to give to operating people. The last one is just an important one for two components. You'll hear net fee income used a lot. The managing partners of a private equity firm, which are part of what's called the GP pool, general partner pool. Everything we do on an annual basis comes out of our 2% management fee, 100% of it. So we can't have any other income in any other way. Even things we can bill portfolio companies for, and there are some things we can, that goes ratably back to our investors right off the top. So it's not money we see. So from a budget standpoint, everything has to come out of this. As we're shopping around looking for deals, if we're buying software licenses to see deal flow, rents, travel, employee benefits, salaries, everything comes out of that 2% fee. The exception to that is a deal. Just as we talked about earlier, when you do a deal, all expenses for that deal go against that deal. So that's the one. Otherwise, you could do a deal that would take a couple $1,000,000, right off the top. You wouldn't have any more room, right? So because it could be expensive. I won't say, especially if you use certain lawyers that we tend to use that rhyme with a certain brand of product from Walmart and Sam's Club. Those lawyers and their fancy ski trip, that costs a lot of money. So in order to budget more effectively, typically the managing partners pay themselves a salary, which is well below what they could be paying themselves. And on a quarterly or annual basis, whatever is left over that year in that fund that hasn't been spent can be paid out ratably to the partners. So you hear net fee income for that reason. So your partners may have an artificially low salary. That's because we don't know what the year is going to look like. We may end up doing a ton of travel. We can budget for it, but we may have more expenses than usual. We don't want to run out of money in the end of the year. So the idea is to keep a pool. It's important because there's some cases where, partners get used to having a big net fee income check. And when they hire an operating partner, an expensive resource, typically, that's going to come out ratably amongst what all the partners get for their NFI. So that's important from understanding why it may be difficult in a firm where one or two partners are really interested in building an operating team and several of the other partners are not. That's one of the places you're going to get the battle is, I'm going to have lower income because you're paying this new operating person. That's very different typically than most corporations. So hiring an employee, they have a budget for that position, but that doesn't affect anybody else's comp. In private equity, hiring each person onto the team affects the managing partner's comp because of this guaranteed budget. So it's important to understand that may be they may want an operating team, but they may not be able to pay for it.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to, as you think about the different compensation models and structures, comes back to the strategy of the fund. What's their hope of building an operating team? What value are they looking for that team to bring? And how much do they want to make the investment? Because it is an investment, right? As we mentioned, you don't have to have an operating team. A lot of private equity firms still don't. Historically, they did not. So this is a strategic choice and investment. And, the compensation model, the structure of how it's set up, all flows from there.
Yeah. Now, what's the reason to pound the table for it is, why we pounded the table for it is one of the founding partners of Parker Gale. My belief is that I'm working for the carry. I'm not working for my annual comp, right? I believe that what we do with the companies is going to make them much more valuable. And in the end, I'm going to get paid for that. That's why you have to believe that in order to do it. If you don't believe that the operating team and the operating partners are going to be helpful in raising the value, increasing the value of your portfolio companies to make your carry worth more, then you're not going to, why would you hire them?
At that case, I would be happy to stay in consulting, right? And just keep working with the companies on a project level basis and go back. But I personally definitely feel so much more skin in the game, and literally because I know my North Star is I want the best returns for these companies, because as I tell my portfolio companies, like, I don't get comp based on how many times I call you or how many times I see you. I want a very, very good outcome for this company. So Jim,
wait, you don't?
I don't what?
You don't get called? Why was I tracking all of our time at NOCO if you don't get paid for every phone call you make? This is news to me.
It was not my choice to track that time, for the record. So
I set that up for you. I gave you that layup.
So
all right. So after all this, we come to the finale. If after everything we've said, you still want a job in private equity.
So I am aware of time. So I'd say let's touch upon this quickly, because I think we're going to definitely do, another part to this podcast series, and we can spend more time here. But as someone who is not necessarily the a huge listener of long form podcasts, um, we can touch upon this one really quickly. But what are some common paths to becoming an operating partner? This is a question we get, and there's so much more we could talk about. But at a high level, you can join a fund that has an existing operating team. Often these searches might come through executive recruiters. Typical backgrounds might be former operating executives, former consultants, sometimes former investment professionals who have been on the deal side of private equity that are interested in getting to the operating side. And I think it can really vary in terms of seniority, but I frequently get a question from MBA students who want to go straight into being an operating team, and I would say that you know there may or may not be chances at some funds that have a program like that, but you can go get other experience, and there will potentially always be doors that open up down the line, and it might not be straight out of an MBA program, and probably even more rarely out of an undergrad program, unless it's like a very established associate or analyst program. Uh, a second thing, if a private equity firm is looking to start an operating team for the first time, you could be the first operating partner at a fund. This can look very different depending on how you get to know them, but you could leverage your relationships with an existing fund if you've already been a consultant or a longtime collaborator. I've heard many stories of people who have become the first operating partner at a fund because they were already a client of, they were a client, the private equity firm was a client of theirs. They were a consultant that worked with them over multiple years. And then they decided they wanted to bring that capability in-house and hire a person that knew their fund well to build out that team. You may be a valued employee from a successful portfolio company that's exited, that may be looking to come into the operating side. And then obviously increasingly there's more executive recruiters that are also playing that role in finding and placing the first operating partner at a fund to introduce you to new funds. And then the third way, this is probably the most difficult, but in the case of Parker Gale, you could raise a new fund with the operating partner model embedded from the start. So Jim is one of our co-founders. You and Devin raised this fund knowing that you were hoping to build this team. And so that was the mentality and the model from the get-go. But there's a lot of different paths to becoming an operating partner. We can spend a lot more time on more of the tactics and interviews and things there. But anything else you would add here, Jim, in terms of different avenues into it?
No, but I think that's I think as you look at it from easiest to hardest, a firm that already has an operating team and has decided they needed a certain skill set and they have a job open, they're recruiting for you, great. To be the first operating partner to fund, it would be very unusual for a fund to say, we're going to hire an operating person and let's get a recruiter and go find our first operating person. It's generally much easier if you've worked with that fund before in some capacity. It seems a more natural fit, not impossible, but it's less common. I would say it may be becoming more common as people think they need operating people on the team. And you have to make a decision whether they're adding operating person on the team because they heard they need an operating person on the team, or they really, have an understanding how they're going to leverage you. And last but not least is generally very difficult. I mean, I've seen this, and I've certainly seen it in a fundless sponsor type of situation, right? Where you get somebody who's a deal hound and somebody who's a good operator, and they pair up and they start out by just doing one-off deals and roll that into a fund. That's easier than just starting a fund from the get-go. Devin and I made the choice to literally raise a fund from the get-go instead of doing kind of deal by deal. It's certainly the hardest, but as an operating partner, you're pari passu with the deal partners in those cases, which is really important. You can Google pari passu. It's Latin, and every deal person knows it. So that's the reason I throw it in.
Put it in the future episodes for vocabulary. Awesome. So, Jim, I think this is definitely the longest podcast episode I've been on.
So the longest one we've recorded, I can tell you. Me personally,
I know we've recorded much longer ones.
That podcast apps have a pause button, right? That they can pause and go back to it later, right? Like, it's not like streaming from Netflix where you have 24 hours to finish that movie once you've downloaded it and started playing it. So,
well, I think we've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully this is helpful to our listeners. I know we have other ideas for follow-ups to this because obviously we can touch upon the day-to-day life of what it's like in the operating partner role, our collaboration with portfolio companies, how we might leverage different resources to scale and grow our operating teams or be more effective. Obviously, there's a lot more time that can be spent on trying to get a job within an operating team or an operating partner role. But hopefully, this was a helpful overview, and I think at least answered some frequently asked questions that we often hear about people who are interested in what the operating partner role looks like and what that might look like at different private equity funds.
I think we did it. A little over an
Ciao
hour.
for now.
Ciao for now.